The promotion meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., but by 8:17, my boss's nephew was already taking congratulations in the executive hallway like the decision had been signed days ago. And the worst part wasn't even the humiliation. It was watching HR pretend not to notice while I sat there holding a leather portfolio filled with 5 years of performance reports, revenue recovery plans, and the exact restructuring strategy my department had been using since January, the same one Derek conveniently presented as his own during the leadership panel 2 weeks earlier. I remember the receptionist giving me that awkward little smile people use when they already know you lost, and when the interview finally started, nobody even looked at my presentation slides because my director spent most of the meeting asking whether I'd feel comfortable supporting Derek during the transition, like I was being demoted before they'd officially rejected me. But at 11:42 a.m., while I was sitting alone in my car trying not to cry in the company parking garage, an anonymous email appeared on my phone with the subject line, "You deserve to know why they chose him," and attached to it was a confidential internal audit report with my boss's signature on every single page. I'd worked at Westbridge Capital for almost 6 years, long enough to recognize the difference between normal office politics and something quietly engineered behind closed doors. And for months the senior operations director role had practically become my second job because while Derek spent most afternoons disappearing into expensive lunches with executives, I was the one fixing reporting errors at midnight, calming furious clients during compliance freezes, and rebuilding accounts after the company lost nearly $3 million during a failed transition the year before. People inside the office joked that I kept the building standing, but somehow those compliments never translated into authority, salary, or promotion. Discussions, especially after my director, Paul Mercer, started bringing his nephew into executive meetings he clearly wasn't qualified to attend, and what made it worse was the way everyone adjusted around it. The forced laughter, the careful silence, the sudden rewriting of credit whenever Derek repeated ideas I'd originally presented in strategy calls, until eventually I stopped correcting people altogether because I realized something dangerous was happening inside that company, something bigger than favoritism, and judging by the confidential audit report sitting unopened in my inbox, somebody inside the building had finally decided I wasn't supposed to lose quietly. I didn't open the audit report immediately because somewhere deep down I already understood that once I read it, the last remaining version of my career at Westbridge Capital would disappear permanently. So instead I sat inside my car in parking level C for almost 20 minutes watching employees walk across the garage with coffee cups and laptop bags like it was a perfectly normal Thursday, while my entire department had just been handed to a man who once asked me whether EBITDA was some kind of software platform. But eventually curiosity outweighed fear and I unlocked the PDF on my phone, only to realize within the first 3 pages that this wasn't about a stolen promotion anymore. The report detailed irregular vendor payments, manipulated compliance approvals, and unauthorized consulting invoices connected to a shell company called Mercer Strategic Holdings, and every approval chain traced back either to my director, Paul Mercer, or Derek himself, including one payment authorized 3 weeks earlier for $418,000 under the category Operational Restructuring Support, which was almost identical to the recovery framework I'd personally written after the failed transition project last year. Except I'd never been paid for it and certainly never approved outside consultants to receive money connected to my work, and the deeper I read, the clearer it became that someone inside finance had been documenting everything quietly for months because entire sections included timestamps, internal Slack screenshots, and scanned signatures from procurement meetings I remembered attending. One screenshot stopped me cold because it showed Derek messaging a finance analyst at 10:14 p.m. saying, "Just push it through before Claire notices the numbers don't match," and seeing my own name in a federal risk discussion like I was an obstacle instead of the person protecting the department made something inside me go completely still. Then my phone rang, and when I saw a private number across the screen, I almost ignored it until a woman calmly said, "Do not discuss that report from your company devices," before hanging up immediately, and suddenly the garage didn't feel quiet anymore because now I understood this wasn't office gossip. This was exposure. When I finally went back upstairs around 1 p.m., the energy on the executive floor had shifted strangely because people stopped talking when I walked past. Derek was suddenly nowhere to be seen, and Paul Mercer had his office door closed for the first time in months. But the strangest moment came when my coworker Nina slid a folded sticky note across my desk without making eye contact, and written on it in hurried blue ink were just 6 words: "Check tomorrow's compliance review attendee list." which sent a chill through me because compliance reviews normally excluded department managers unless legal was involved. I waited until nearly everyone left the office before opening the internal scheduling portal. And there it was, Friday, 8:30 a.m., Executive Compliance Review, Conference Room 14B. Mandatory attendees included Paul Mercer, Derek Mercer, 2 senior finance controllers, outside counsel, and my name, even though nobody had informed me I'd been added. But what truly made my stomach drop was the final attendee listed. At the bottom of the calendar entry, representatives from the Office of Corporate Accountability Review Board, which explained why people on the executive floor suddenly looked terrified, because somebody higher than HR had entered the building, and judging by the audit report sitting in my inbox, they weren't coming to discuss a promotion anymore. I barely slept that night because every time I closed my eyes, I kept replaying the tiny details I'd ignored for months. Derek suddenly receiving access to restricted financial dashboards he wasn't certified to use, Paul canceling procurement reviews whenever outside auditors visited, finance employees quietly resigning without farewell lunches. And by 6:10 Friday morning, I was already sitting inside a coffee shop across from Westbridge Capital rereading the audit report while trying to understand why someone had risked forwarding it to me specifically, until I noticed something I'd missed before. Several approval timestamps occurred while Paul Mercer was officially out of state attending an investor summit in Chicago, which meant someone else had been using his executive authorization credentials internally. And suddenly Derek's rushed promotion started making terrifying sense because if regulators were preparing an investigation, elevating him into leadership could give them a controlled scapegoat while protecting people higher up. By the time I entered the building at 7:48 a.m., security presence on the executive floor had doubled, conversations were reduced to whispers, and even HR looked panicked instead of performative, especially when Melissa from Employee Relations pulled me aside near the elevators and quietly asked, "Has anyone contacted you directly outside work?" before immediately pretending she'd only asked about onboarding documents when another manager walked past, and that was the exact moment I realized people weren't afraid of losing jobs, they were afraid of being connected to whatever investigators already knew. At 8:26, Conference Room 14B opened, and the atmosphere inside felt less like a meeting and more like a deposition because outside legal counsel sat beside 2 federal compliance representatives reviewing printed binders while Paul Mercer tried unsuccessfully to project confidence at the head of the table, though the sweat gathering beneath his collar told a very different story, and Derek looked even worse because he kept checking his phone every few seconds until one of the compliance officers calmly said, "Please place all devices face down during review," which made the entire room go silent. The meeting began with procedural language about procurement inconsistencies and executive authorization misuse, but the tension changed instantly when a gray-haired investigator slid a stack of invoices across the table and asked Paul why multiple consulting contracts had been approved under strategic initiatives that didn't legally exist inside company filings, and for the first time in 6 years, I watched my director genuinely lose composure because instead of answering directly, he looked toward Derek before saying, "Those operational drafts were delegated internally," which was corporate language for sacrifice somebody else quickly, except Derek immediately panicked and said, "Claire handled most operational restructuring," and suddenly every head in the room turned toward me. I remember the exact silence that followed because it lasted just long enough for Paul to realize Derek had accidentally redirected federal attention toward the wrong person. But before either of them could continue, the investigator opened another binder and calmly said, "Ms. Bennett's records are precisely why we're here," then projected a timeline onto the conference room screen showing dozens of instances where my documented recommendations directly contradicted the fraudulent approvals being investigated, including emails I'd sent warning finance leadership about unverified consulting transfers months earlier that had apparently been ignored. Derek's face visibly drained of color while Paul stared at the screen like he was seeing those emails for the first time. And the investigator continued in the same measured tone. "Your employee repeatedly identified procedural risks while executive authorization chains bypassed her department entirely," which was the moment the room shifted permanently because suddenly I wasn't the overlooked manager they could quietly discredit anymore. I was documented evidence that someone inside leadership knowingly ignored internal compliance warnings, and judging by the expressions around that table, several executives were realizing too late that promoting Derek before the investigation closed might have been the mistake that exposed all of them publicly. The meeting paused at 9:17 a.m. after one of the federal compliance representatives requested private review sessions with individual department heads, but nobody stood up immediately because the atmosphere inside conference room 14B had become suffocating in a way I'd never experienced before. The kind of silence where people realize the story they've rehearsed for months is collapsing in real time. And Paul Mercer looked especially shaken because every attempt to redirect responsibility toward operations had backfired the moment investigators displayed my archived compliance warnings on the screen, complete with timestamps, escalation requests, and ignored follow-up emails sent directly to executive leadership. I remember one particular email projected across the wall from February 11th at 6:42 p.m. where I'd written, "Vendor authorization discrepancies continue appearing under restricted approval credentials," and seeing my own words enlarged beside federal audit codes made something click emotionally because for the first time since losing the promotion, I understood I hadn't been excluded because I lacked qualifications. I'd been excluded because my documentation made me dangerous to people already manipulating internal systems. While investigators escorted finance personnel into separate review rooms, Derek suddenly approached me near the conference table with the desperate energy of someone trying to repair a sinking ship using conversation alone, and in a low voice he said, "Claire, if there's confusion about who handled approvals, we can clear it up together," which almost would have sounded sincere if I hadn't personally trained him on half the systems he'd been falsely claiming to manage for months. But before I could respond, one of the investigators interrupted calmly and asked Derek whether he recognized a specific consulting invoice connected to Mercer Strategic Holdings, and watching his confidence evaporate in seconds was almost surreal because the man who'd strutted through executive hallways 24 hours earlier now looked physically cornered. By late morning, rumors had already started spreading across the building because employees noticed outside counsel entering restricted offices, security temporarily locking accounting servers, and senior leadership canceling investor calls without explanation. And the strangest part was how differently people treated me now because coworkers who barely acknowledged my existence last week suddenly lowered their voices when speaking to me, like they'd realized I wasn't the woman who quietly lost a promotion anymore. I was the person federal investigators kept referencing during compliance interviews. Around noon, Nina from finance entered my office carrying 2 coffees and closed the door behind her before saying, "They thought promoting Derek would stabilize the timeline before quarter-end reporting." Then she explained something that made the entire situation even uglier. Internal auditors had flagged procurement irregularities nearly 7 months earlier, but leadership delayed formal escalation because exposure during acquisition negotiations could have destroyed executive bonuses tied to the company's valuation, meaning the promotion process itself may have been designed not to reward competence, but to place loyal people into leadership positions before the investigation surfaced publicly. Then she handed me printed copies of executive meeting summaries showing multiple references to operational containment risks, which was apparently how they described me internally whenever I questioned unauthorized transfers or policy violations. And seeing my professionalism reframed as a corporate threat honestly hurt more than losing the promotion itself because I realized they'd spent months managing around my integrity instead of listening to it. At 2:43 p.m., however, the situation exploded publicly when an emergency all-staff meeting notification appeared company-wide instructing employees to report to the main auditorium immediately, and the second I walked inside, I knew something catastrophic had happened because entire executive rows were empty except for legal counsel and interim leadership representatives, while employees whispered frantically about suspended accounts and confiscated laptops. But everything changed the moment the acting compliance officer stepped onto the stage and announced that several senior executives had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending federal review, including Paul Mercer, and the audible gasp across the auditorium was quickly followed by stunned silence when she added, "An interim restructuring lead will oversee operational continuity effective immediately," before turning toward the front row and saying my name. For a few seconds after the acting compliance officer said my name, nobody inside the auditorium moved because the announcement didn't just surprise employees. It shattered the entire hierarchy people at Westbridge Capital had spent years treating like permanent reality, and I could physically feel hundreds of eyes shifting between me and the empty executive seats where Paul Mercer and Derek were supposed to be sitting. But what I remember most clearly was Derek standing near the auditorium exit with 2 compliance representatives beside him, still wearing the same navy suit he'd proudly chosen for his promotion day. Except now his access badge hung clipped upside down against his jacket like even the building itself had rejected him. The compliance officer continued explaining that interim leadership decisions were based on documented operational performance, procedural integrity, and internal reporting history, which was the closest corporate language could come to publicly admitting they'd ignored the wrong employee for years. And while the room processed that reality, I stayed completely still because reacting emotionally would have given people the spectacle they expected from someone who just watched executives collapse publicly. But this wasn't triumph, it was confirmation. After the meeting ended, employees flooded hallways whispering theories while legal teams escorted executives through private corridors usually reserved for investors. And around 4 p.m. I was temporarily reassigned to the executive operations office that Paul Mercer had occupied for nearly a decade. Except now half the shelves were empty because compliance staff had already boxed financial records into evidence containers marked with federal tracking labels. Sitting inside that office felt strangely quiet, almost unreal until I noticed a framed leadership quote Paul kept behind his desk that read, "Control perception and you control outcomes," which suddenly explained almost everything about how the company had operated under him, because for years perception mattered more than competence, loyalty mattered more than ethics, and silence mattered more than truth, until documentation made perception impossible to control anymore. Later that evening, while reviewing transition materials with interim legal counsel, I learned the acquisition negotiations Nina mentioned had already collapsed after investigators uncovered inconsistencies in executive disclosures. Executive bonuses were frozen pending review, and Mercer Strategic Holdings was officially under forensic accounting investigation. But the moment that stayed with me happened shortly before 7 p.m., when HR forwarded an internal correction notice to all employees clarifying that my prior operational recommendations had consistently aligned with compliance best practices, which was a painfully sanitized way of admitting the company spent months ignoring the person trying to protect it. Then my office phone rang, and when I answered, there was a long silence before Paul Mercer finally spoke in a voice I barely recognized anymore, asking, "Did you know this was coming?" And I remember staring through the glass office wall at employees working quietly beneath the evening lights before calmly replying. I knew something was wrong when qualified people started being treated like liabilities, because that was the truth. I never orchestrated their collapse, I just refused to help them hide it. He went silent after that, probably realizing too late that the most dangerous person in a corrupt system isn't the loudest employee, but the observant one who documents everything carefully while everyone else mistakes restraint for weakness. And after the call ended, I opened the company-wide leadership announcement one final time and reread the line beneath my temporary appointment title. Selected based on demonstrated operational credibility during internal review, which felt strangely satisfying because less than 48 hours earlier I'd been sitting alone in a parking garage wondering why they chose the boss's nephew over me. And now the same executives who underestimated me were being investigated partly because they ignored the woman already doing the job better than all of them combined. 3 months later, federal investigators formally expanded the case into financial misconduct and executive fraud review. Derek quietly disappeared from every professional networking platform connected to Westbridge Capital, and Paul Mercer's name was removed from the leadership wall outside the executive floor without announcement, almost like the company hoped employees would slowly forget he'd ever been there at all. But people remembered because corporate buildings never really erase humiliation, they just repaint over it and hope nobody asks questions. Meanwhile, the restructuring plan I originally created became the framework that stabilized operations during the investigation. And for the first time in my career, executives actually listened when I spoke instead of waiting for a louder man to repeat my ideas 5 minutes later. Though honestly the most satisfying moment came during a quarterly leadership meeting, when a new analyst nervously apologized for documenting a compliance concern, and I told her calmly, "Never apologize for keeping records, because some of the most dangerous people in business survive by assuming nobody's paying attention long enough to connect the details." If you've ever stayed quiet while people underestimated your value, your intelligence, or your integrity, subscribe. Because sometimes the strongest revenge isn't destroying someone publicly. It's surviving long enough to watch their own decisions do it for you.